Okay, thank you all for coming to this live recording of 200 Norwegians, which is a bi-weekly podcast about Norwegians who, over the past 200 years, have helped shape America. And one of those 200 Norwegians is sitting right across from me. He's not done it by building railroads, homesteading, or being a cowboy out west, at least not that I'm aware of. But he's done it by telling the stories of those who did. He has taught at University of Oslo, at St. Olaf's College, among other places. He has written 25 books and edited many more. He has received more honors and awards than I have time to list here now, but I will mention that he's shaken hands with multiple Norwegian kings. And he didn't come only as a guest, I will tell you that much. My first encounter with Odd Lovoll was 6 years ago when I began researching a book on Norwegian immigration. And I was struck by how accessible his books were. He helped me unpack the waves of Norwegian immigration to America, how Norwegians settle in the US during the first, second, and third wave. And he elaborated on why and how they often settled in rural areas and why they were more ethnocentric than Swedes and Germans. Ethnocentric is another way of saying that you're obsessed by your identity. And in doing so, he also explained pretty intricate concepts, such as the flight of the second generation, endogamy, which, for the record, is the practice of marrying within an ethnic group. But even while diving into these pretty complex topics, he was able to maintain a high academic standard. And his books were never, ever boring. They were always full of colorful and often overlooked stories, like Norwegian tobacco cultivation in Wisconsin and Norwegian prostitution in Chicago. So thank you for that, Odd. Thank you for not being boring and giving me insights in prostitution, I suppose. And thank you more than anything for your dedication. A case in point here is that I contacted Odd approximately 2 months ago. And obviously, I knew that he hadn't gotten any younger since last time around. But I certainly hoped that he would be in good health. But when I first reached out to me, he told me, I asked him if he wanted to do a podcast, and he said, I recently had a stroke, but let's do it. I'm up for it. So, I think that's a good testament to his dedication, perhaps also to his Norwegian stubbornness a little bit. So, this year marks the 200th anniversary of organized immigration to America, and you spent most of your professional life researching and writing about this topic. So I want to ask you, why do you think it is important? Why is it important to tell these stories?
Well, why is that important? Yes. I could give a long talk about that if I want to, but it's interesting. Norwegians constitute a part of the United States, and they had influence on how this country developed, and also they had influence on how Norway developed by their contact back to Norway. I still remember my own childhood in Norway, when the influence that people who had lived in America for a while and came back to Norway, that was one thing, but also the gifts and so forth that the Norwegian-Americans gave to Norway. That was important for Norway, and they learned about America, and Americans learned about Norwegians and what they could offer, and they did offer quite a bit to this country. And I'm very proud to say that and we can have many examples. And what comes to my mind right away is that they introduced education, like St. Olaf College, and there are 6 universities founded by Norwegian-Americans, and they are a very important part of American life. And we need to know about that, and individual Norwegians need to know about their history in this country so that they can appreciate what they did, what the ancestors did, and how they must be remembered. And I don't know if I've answered the question, but that's my ideas about it.
That perfectly answers my question. And again, you've written extensively about immigrants, but today we're also shifting focus a little bit. We're gonna talk about you, because you yourself is an immigrant. In fact, you immigrated to America twice. And you were born in 1934, which means you were 6 years old when World War II broke out.
Yeah,
and
I can't hear what you said. There's a microphone.
I will repeat it.
Oh, yeah.
What do you remember from those years, the war years?
Yes, what I remember, I was born in 1934. I hate to say that, but that's when I was born. And so I was old enough to remember when the Germans invaded Norway. And the panic. I grew up in a very remote part of Norway, but it was a coastal region, so that the Germans came there very early, even though it was remote, because it was a coastal community and where most of the ships went through. And I do remember the people talking about, I was then too young to really read newspapers, but we had Sunnmørsposten published in Ålesund, and I know my people around me, my uncle and his family and my mother. My father was at this time in America because he was a whaler and could not make it back to Norway from South Africa. And I do remember funny things too, like my mother taking down the curtains so the Germans wouldn't take it, and also silverware, hiding that so the Germans wouldn't. And I don't think the Germans were interested in that whatsoever. But there was panic. There was panic, and people were afraid as the Germans came closer and closer. And I do remember when the Germans walked past the farm where I lived. They in big trucks also, and some of them marched past. And there was a military installation very close to where I lived, and the church we went to, there were German guards on both sides, and you have to explain why you're doing what you're doing in order to pass through the German installation. And that was during the occupation, and I also remember so well the prisoners of war. They were Polish and Russian, and they were building a telephone line right by where we lived, because there was no telephone where I grew up. And they were building that, and I saw the German soldiers stand there and then command the prisoners of war to work with this. But then I also like to mention that, and one thing you must not forget is that no matter which side of the war you're on, you are all human beings. And I still remember a German soldier coming up to the house and knocking on our door. And he was crying, so we opened up, and then he wanted to show us pictures of his children in Germany that he had not seen for 2 years, because he was in the military. And that is something I do remember from this time. So the Germans were also human, but they had their command. So they practiced the guns, and we had to be in our house and not go out where they practice their big, kind of protection for where they were. So sometimes things were exploding right close to where I lived. And I do remember that. And during the war. And I also remember ships being sunk. And I remember ships had these blimps. And you know what a blimp is? A balloon above the boat so that the planes could not come close to it. But that didn't help because in the beginning of the war, we saw then the German planes, the Fliegende Festung, that is the flying fortress, huge German planes, and they flew very close. Later on, there were British planes coming in, and they were the ones who then sank boats coming through there. And I do remember seeing people wounded, and people talk about dead people, corpses floating on the fjord. I don't know if I ever saw one, but I heard people talk about that a lot. And I did see the ships bombed and inflamed and sink in the fjord. Those are some of my memories, and also the memories are that the rationing card, and it's very limited what you could buy, very limited. And I know my mother, we were 3 children, an older brother and a younger sister. And it was, my mother had struggled to feed us. And I still remember many times she went into a room by herself and sat and cried because our children were. And I get very emotional when I think about my mother, what she went through to get food for us. And we did not get flour. We got some kind of a substitute. But then there was one Christmas where it was announced that we could get a little Swiss post, is what they call a very small amount of wheat flour. And my mother then took to the nearest store, which was quite a distance away, with a horse and buggy, and came back Christmas Eve and baked then smoultering donuts. And I think we children got 3 each of us, and I don't think she got any because she gave it to us. And, you know, that's a funny memory of the war. And I don't know if I should go on, but
Please go on.
because things come back to me. And I do so remember when the capitulation of the war, another international mention probably, because that I do remember because that was in the newspaper so much when the Jews were arrested and sent to Auschwitz to go to be executed. That I do remember so well. And they were born in Norway, the youngest, and the others were refugees from Russia, Jewish, and came from Sweden to where I lived in Norway. And I so remember they had Norwegian names, these 2 children I think about now. And the doctors in Olsen tried to save the boy because he was sick and took him to the hospital, but that didn't help. And what we should remember is that the Germans were not the ones who arrested, but Norwegians were those who arrested the Nazis. They were the ones who arrested Jewish people. And they were taken to Auschwitz and put to death. And that is something that also was written in the newspaper because the Germans allowed the newspaper to write about those things, but never write about German defeat any place. But those things, they were in there. And I so remember that. And then just a couple of words maybe about when the Germans capitulated. And that was, of course, wild. And maybe I shouldn't say this, but Norwegians celebrated the way Norwegians do sometimes, not in the best way. And you can imagine. But suddenly there was the Norwegian flag, which was prohibited to use during World War II. And there was the pictures of King Haakon the King of Norway, who lived then for the war years in England. And I remember seeing that. And then my mother thought we should go to a church. And when we went to a church, we didn't have a car, but a horse and buggy. The German guards were gone from the area where they had, and we didn't see the Germans at all, and not the prisoners of war. But we went to church, and the church was filled with people, and I still remember the pastor, and I have his name in my book, Two Homelands. And so I remember he got up, and then before he began speaking, he wiped his eyes, and then he said, very emotionally, Norge fritt igjen. How many understand that? Yeah. And I'll never forget it. Norway is free again. And people, they began crying. And I know my mother did, and so did a lot of people, because they were celebrating that Norway was free again. And I get so emotional when I talk about that, because I saw all these people celebrate that. And then I think that's as much as I want to say about World War II. Do you have another question?
I do have another question.
Yeah.
You were, as you mentioned, 11 years old when the war ended. This was a time back in Norway for rebuilding. They wanted to rebuild the country.
Yeah.
But your family after the war actually ended up moving to America,
Yeah.
to Seattle. Can you tell me a little bit about how it was to arrive to America as an 11-year-old back in the 40s?
My father had, maybe go further back, because I was born in a part of Norway where they have very low immigration, because immigration began in May. And that was the time when the fisheries on the coast began. And so people from Sunnmøre, where I came from, they always said the fisheries are all America. So they had a low immigration rate, but in spite of that, my grandfather was the only one who did not go to America of 5 brothers. So 4 of his brothers went to America. So I have a lot of relatives in America. And because of that, when my father was 19 years old, or 18, 19, he went to America for 6 years to his uncles to make some money. And then he came back and bought a little farm, because he was going to go back to America, but the Depression was then beginning, and people in America, his friends, said he should not come. And then so he went in, made a living. I remember that he, as a whaler, going to the Antarctic. And the Cosmos One was the name of the ship. And I still remember my father telling about Africa and having gifts from Africa. And that was quite unique for that part of Norway. And because most of the whalers came from Eastern Norway, not from Western Norway. And so when the Germans occupied Norway, he could not come back from Africa, but he went instead to Canada. And then from Canada, his uncles helped him to get back into the United States. He was then, his papers, he was then an American citizen, but he had left his papers back home, so he could not prove to authorities. But he made it to Seattle and began fishing. And for 7 long years, he did not see his family, and there was no connection. The Red Cross had once a while they were able to deliver a letter from him, and it was very old, and we wrote back, and he rarely got what he wrote to him, so I felt so sorry for my father. But then when the peace came, then he wanted us to come over to America. And I still remember for the first time in my life, I went to a big city to get the papers with my mother, because he did not come to Norway to pick us up, but he just told us to come to America. So my mother was then responsible for doing that. And for the first time in my life, I went to a city, because a big city, and Oslo then was a fairly big city. And I remember for the first time in my life, I saw something called an escalator, stairs that rolled upstairs. Yeah, this was quite something. And then also what made an impression, because I had an aunt who lived in Oslo, and her family. And they took us to the Vigeland Park, and I know how shocked we all were to see all those naked statues. And that was explained to us. But anyway, we got our papers, and I still remember the American, and then the embassy was then open, and the ambassador, he came from London, where the Norwegian government had been during the war. Because there's one thing we should keep in mind, that the Germans took Norway, but Norway never officially capitulated to the Germans, never. Because the government made it to England and it did not capitulate. So the connection to, so Norway had, during the war, an ambassador in Washington, D.C. the whole time. And so I do remember that, and I remember my grandfather Odin. He went with us to Bergen, and we took Stavangerfjord from. It looked like a big ship, but it was an old ship by then, and but it was then a Norwegian-American line. So for a week, then we were on the boat, and then we came to New York and saw the Statue of Liberty. So remember that. And we took a train then from New York, the Traveler's Aid. And do you know what a Traveler's Aids are? But they can help you when you travel. If you don't, you can hire them. And my father had done that, so we were met by Traveler's Aid, who took us to the train to Chicago. And then we had to wait whole day in Chicago. And the Travelers Aid, they felt sorry for us, and they went and bought us ice cream. And to their shock, they had children who didn't like ice cream, because we had never had ice cream, before we came to America. But anyway, they found one person who spoke Norwegian, who spoke to us in Chicago. And then we took the train from Chicago to Seattle, and then I remember landing in Seattle, and I saw that man, but for me I was a child, and I did not recognize my father. And my younger sister, when she saw he hugged me, and I let him hug me, and he hugged my bigger brother, but my sister ran to hide when he came to hug her. She had no idea that was her father. And my father had lived with his uncle Ole and Aunt Lena, Ole and Lena in Seattle. And I actually have an Ole and Lena in my family. And so that's where he lived during the war. And then we took we lived for a while with Ole and Lena, and then bought a house that we moved into on Earl Avenue, which was close to where we would go to school. And that was quite something to begin school. Did you have any questions about that?
Of course, yes.
Yeah.
So in your autobiography, you also write about the fact that you had a very close relationship to your older brother. In many ways, he was like a father figure for you during the...
He was like during World War II, because my father was not there. Right. And my older brother was born in 1930 and was quite a bit older than I was. And he was the one that we always went to during the war. And so he was like a, what do you call it, big brother father. And now, of course, I miss my brother so much. And so he helped us adjust. Before we went to America, he had taken half a year course in English at an advanced school in that area. So he knew a little bit of English when we came. And that was the big thing, to learn English for us. I felt so foreign to Seattle, coming as an 11-year-old child. And me meeting all the strange things in a big city that Seattle was and still is. And it's a huge city now, but it was big even back in 1946. Did you have any questions about that?
Yeah, because in your book, again, you mentioned that he was the academic type, just like yourself. He was constantly reading. But in order to go to college, he needed to save up some money. So he started working on a fishing boat with your father. But then something tragic happened that changed your life, changed your family's life, and eventually brought you back to Norway. Can you walk us through that? And
my big brother, he really grew up so fast because the responsibility he had. So he went back to Norway himself for a visit when he was 18 from Seattle. But then when he came back, he wanted to save money so he could go to college, because he was a very sort of intellectual kind of person. Already had a big library that he had collected as a young man. And he then, my father had a fishing boat called Atu. Not a big boat, but a small boat. But he went fishing on that, and he was then fishing then halibut, and my brother went with him to save money, and together with them was my father's younger brother, Bendik was his name, and who lived in Seattle also. And they went then down to the coast of California, and suddenly there was a storm, and my brother and Bendik were washed overboard. And Bendik, my father never saw, but my brother was swimming along the boat. But back then, and they're much better now, there were no requirement of fishing boats to have equipment to save somebody who should fall off a boat. So there was no way my father could help my brother. But my brother tried so much. I'm sorry, but he just raised his hand and then drowned. My father told me. And I also remember that all of a sudden we were called home from school. We were at school when this happened, and we were taken home. And there my mother sat there together with the pastor crying and said that your brother drowned, Odd. And that was so difficult to accept. I know I went into my room and cried, and I missed my brother so much the day. And because my father, then could not continue fishing for a while because of what happened. So he worked a little bit building as a carpenter, and before he began fishing again. And then it all was so sad, so we decided we were going to make a trip to Norway to talk to people there. And that was then my brother drowned on my father's 49th birthday, October 9th. And so we could not celebrate my father's 50th birthday because of it. And but we did go back to Norway in my last year in high school in Seattle. And I had not quite finished high school. So as I now tell my grandchildren, and one of them is here now, wonderful, that Grandpa is a dropout from high school. but it is very interesting. When I visited Seattle years later, I talked to them about it, and all of a sudden I got an honorary graduation from them. So I did anyway, I guess. But we were going back to Norway for a little bit, and because of this, and then my father had always this idea that he would retire to Norway, and so we had I and my younger sister and mother, we stayed there then for a year, and then we had ordered tickets to get back to America. But all of a sudden we got a letter then from my father who said that he would like us to stay in Norway and not come back. And I know my sister cried so because she wanted to go back to America. And my mother wanted to go back to America, and I wanted to. And my mother then agreed to this only if my father would move to Norway early and stay with us. And he tried for 1 year, and then wasn't able to make enough money. So he began fishing again. So for more than half the year, he was in America until he was 65. And so my mother was alone again with us. And so America became such a close thing because my father then, we went over, and he took my mother over for 1 year because so she wouldn't be alone. But so America was always very close. And so I always wanted to go back to America, but I got my education in Norway, and then began working in Norway as a teacher. And so we stayed there then, and as I told Frederick here, I was never quite accepted as a Norwegian after moving back to Norway. I was always the American. Here comes the American. And and as I told Frederick too, sure to talk about that. Then I for one summer, I had a job as a night porter at Alexandria Hotel in Loen, Norway. And that is the biggest hotel in the countryside in Norway. And it's a tourist hotel. And I was a night porter. And then I, every morning before I went to rest a little bit, I went to the kitchen and have a cup of coffee and something. And there I met a young woman. I was then 21 years old, a woman who was 20 years old. And she became, after a while, we fell in love. And when I was 23 and she was 22, we got married. And that is how I met my wife. And she never once talked about me as American. To her, I was just Odd. And that was wonderful. And she then, for her to think about going to America was difficult. But then I got an offer. I had a job then in a place called Volda in Sunnmøre, and I taught at the gymnasium. That is the I don't know how would you translate a gymnasium into Norway.
Well, you can't really say that it's high school, and you can't really say that it's college. It's a mix of the two.
It's more like a junior college, yeah. And I taught then English, and I taught history, and I taught, believe it or not, I taught Norwegian. And that was sort of interesting. And now when I go back to Norway, I meet my former students, and they're very nice to talk to at that time. And then in 1967, I got an offer from the University of North Dakota to teach Norwegian there. And I accepted if they would allow me to teach history at the same time, and that they did. So I taught U.S. history at an American college, American university, in addition to Norwegian language.
Can I jump right in there? Because
What's that?
can I jump right in there?
What's that? Yeah.
Because as you mentioned to me before this talk, has been a lifelong struggle of yours to have the name Odd in America. And when you got to Norway, you also experienced being called the American.
Yeah.
The first person that ever called you Odd, who actually called you by your correct name. And I should add that Odd is a perfectly normal name in Norway.
Yeah.
She ended up being your wife, but you certainly had a strong, you had the experience of being different in Norway and in America. So I wanted to ask you, how did that immigrant experience put you on the path to become a historian with Norwegian-American history as his field of expertise,
Yes.
so to say?
Yeah, yes, I was then, as you said, the American in Norway, except for my wife. She called me Odd. And actually, my reason for, I did take a degree in Norway in Norwegian history also. And so I concentrated on immigration. But really, the reason why I began studying immigration was that it was a pathway to understand myself. Who are you, Wood? Yes, an immigrant. Who was I? And I began studying what does it mean to be an immigrant, because that is what I was. Because I was an immigrant when I came to America when I was 11, and I felt I was still an immigrant when I came back to Norway. And actually, when I studied then history at the University of Oslo, the person who examined me was a person called Ingrid Semmingsen, and she was famous for writing books about Norwegian immigration. And we became friends, actually, and so forth. And so that was one reason I began studying what it meant to be an immigrant. What is an immigrant? And try to understand my time in America and my time back in Norway. And then met a lot of people who had lived for a while in America. And so I began studying this, and from trying to understand myself, it then became a study of immigration in general. And not only Norwegian immigrants, but other immigrants too. And so I think that's my answer to that.
Yeah. But let's jump a little bit forward, because in 1983, you published The løfterike landet, later translated to English.
I don't hear it.
I will repeat all of it.
Oh, yeah, okay.
And it was later translated to English. And it's, by the way, now considered a classic. There is now a new edition out, which can be purchased all over town, I'm sure. But it became like, it received widespread praise pretty much right off the bat. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think this book struck a nerve back in 1983? I've been told that you were almost treated like a rock star when you went back to Norway with this book. So,
and I have to tell you something funny that happened with løfterike, because that's the word I came up with. Yeah. And do you understand what means løfterike? Yeah, rich in promise. And but the press couldn't find that word in a Norwegian dictionary, and so they asked Norway has something called a language commission, which decides what is good Norwegian or not. And they had to go to the language commission to ask if this was a word they could use, løfterike. And then the commission said, okay, it's a fine word. And so that is my contribution to the Norwegian language. And now they use it all over the place. There's even a big history committee in Bergen which took the name løfterike And they had no idea that that came from me. But I knew I had a book called the løfterike, landet, the land of promise. And then and then I was in Norway when it was released. And as you said, I was so surprised. The bookstores, the windows were filled with my book. And then we had the University Press had at the Grand Hotel a big release of it. And the newspapers all over Norway, they praised it. To my surprise, they found it very good. And I think that there was a need for a book like that. So I think that must have been it. There's also the University of Oslo Press, together with the newspaper Aftenposten, Norway's biggest newspaper. They decided to have an exhibit based on my book. King Olaf was the one who opened the exhibit. And the people who arranged it told me that it was one of the most popular exhibits they had had in Norway at all, out at Høvegården, where this was. And I have to tell one more thing, how the book, or how this whole thing was received. Because I also, 2 days after it was open, I was invited to speak about it. There were a lot of people present, and then there could be questions and comments afterwards. And I so remembered that Einar Haugen, does anyone know who he was? Yeah, a big linguist. He wrote about the Norwegian-American language. And he rose to say something, but then he began crying, emotion, and sat down. He wasn't able to say anything. And if you knew Einar Haugen, that was quite something. But I think people were it was quite emotional to see a book like this and exhibit like this. And to remind them of the Norwegians who lived in America. And I had a lot of questions about that. And then this exhibit, it went to various cities in Norway, and then it went to America in 1985, and it was for a whole year in the Minnesota Historical Society had a whole year. The exhibit, did anyone of you see it? You saw it, yeah. It was there for a whole year. And then in 1986, the exhibit went to Ellis Island to celebrate the centennial of the Statue of Liberty. And the exhibit is still at Ellis Island. So I just want to say how a book can play a role if you, in the right circumstances. And mine did. I think not because of what I wrote, but because people were hungry for something like that.
One other thing that I want to touch on here, I did mention it before, that it's a very accessible read. One of the reasons why I find it very accessible is that there are a lot of pictures in it. Unlike many historical works at the time. Reading the book, you see that these pictures come from very many different sources. So it must have taken you a lot of time to just collect all these pictures. Yeah. Can you tell a little bit about why you thought it was important to actually illustrate this story, not only writing it?
Well, I thought it was a part of the project, and I want to say, when I write history, I always think of my audience as the general public. And I think the general public appreciates then pictures. But not only the general public, I still remember John Hyam, who was a major American historian. And he wrote a review of it, and what he really appreciated very much were how he illustrated what I had to say. And he thought that even for him, it made it easier for him to understand what was there. And so I thought that the picture would add to the text something and make it easier for people to understand what I was trying to say. So, for example, I have a picture of the first church built by Norwegians in America in the book, and I think that's important for people to see. And many things like that I do have. And so I thought pictures were very important, and I still think they are very important to have. And the other books I've written, I do the same. And what has frustrated me a little bit is that the Minnesota Historical Society Press, they have a limit to how many pictures you can use. And I argue with them, and sometimes they gave in and let me have more pictures than they first said I could have. Because I think people need to look at pictures to really understand what I'm writing about. I think that helps a lot.
Another thing which is very interesting about your way of writing history is that you go to many places. You visit a lot. You have visited a lot of places over the course of your career. I don't know how many states you've been to, but somebody told me, actually your son told me, that you've been to pretty much every Norwegian community in America, which sounds insane.
Yes.
But can you tell me a little bit, because this is very salient in many of your works. For instance, the book you wrote about Chicago, you told me yourself that you actually went to Chicago and you lived there for 2 years in order to research the book. So I want to ask you, why do you think first-hand experience is so important in order to write, to give an accurate description of a topic?
Yes, just a little correction. I spent 2 years in Chicago, but I didn't live there all the time because I lived in Northfield, Minnesota. And but I went quite regularly and spent a couple of 3 or 4 weeks there, and before I went back to Northfield. And I lived right in the Logan Square area. And I worked with a Chicago History Committee, and a good friend was the head of it, Olaf Eriksson, and helped me a lot. And so I was right there in Logan Square. And what was interesting is that Logan Square is now Mexican citizens live there now, but they still have a Norwegian church right in Logan Square. And I went around to all these places and talked to people. And Chicago is very interesting because they have sections of Chicago which is totally then ethnic. That is, I remember I visited the Ukrainian, and everybody there is a Ukrainian almost. And like Logan Square was almost totally Norwegian at one time. But the Norwegians have now moved out to the suburbs mostly, but there still are places. There's a Polish part of Chicago, and there's this and that, and that made me interested in all kinds of ethnic groups, not just Norwegians. And I learned a lot from that. But I think, as you said, it's very important. So when I wrote my book, The Promise Fulfilled, I visited 30 states and to talk to people in various states. And I spent a whole year together with an assistant visiting then Norwegian areas. The only states where they have a lot of Norwegians who I couldn't visit was Hawaii and Alaska. And I later was Alaska, but anyway, you have to. I think it's very important to be there to really understand what's going on when you write about something.
One of your former colleagues also mentioned that you drew inspiration from a lot of unconventional places. One thing that he mentioned was, for instance, that you were reading a lot of African American studies.
Mm-hmm. A lot of.
Huh?
What did you say now?
one of your colleagues said that you read a lot of African American studies. You were interested in that field of history. And I wanted to ask you, how did that kind of research inform and inspire your research on Norwegian-American history?
Well, my interest in immigration expands to actually to all immigrant groups. I'm interested in I got interested in how the African Americans adjusted, and I had discussions in Norway because in Denmark, Norway had a slave station in Western Africa called Christiania. And when I did, and Norwegians don't want to talk about that, they were selling slaves or transporting slaves from Africa to, and I got interested in how these people adjusted to America after they were liberated, because they really were not liberated. And if you talk to friends who are black, they will tell you they're not quite feel liberated yet. There is a lot of prejudice yet. And so I was interested in seeing how it's a part of my interest in ethnic groups in general. And the black, that was sort of an extreme group because they were not immigrants, they were slaves, brought over as slaves. And then they were liberated, and how did their past then, did they have connections to Africa, or did they know anything about Africa? Or were they just, they were so different in their experience from other groups. So I got interested in that for that reason.
So over the course of your career, you have written on Norwegian on the prairie, in the cities. You've written about bygdelag. You've written about deep water sailors and Colonel Hegg and many others. Now that you're 90 years old, let's just imagine that you had another 90 years to live and research and write books. What would you have spent those 90 years on? What would you have written about?
But before I answer that, I would like to say something about my family.
Go ahead.
Yeah, regardless, we have talked now a lot about what I've written and stuff, but the most important part of my life has been my family. There's nothing, that what honors I've gotten or what books I've written that is more important than my family. And my grandson, Peter Magnar, is here today with me, and he honors my brother's name too, by Magnar. Where are you sitting, Magnar? Is he? Oh yeah, there he is. Yeah, and but my family is so important to me. I and my wife had 2 children, and I have 5 grandchildren, and I have 4 great-grandchildren. And so that is the most important thing for me in my life. And on top of that, then, my writing is an interest I have. And I have developed that because I'm interested in it. And if I lived to write, the thing we haven't talked about is that the 1990 census had found that there were almost 3 million Americans who define themselves as first ethnicity Norwegian or second ethnicity Norwegian. And I wonder, about 3 million did that. And I wonder if they added to those who have the third ethnicity was Norwegian, we might come up to much more than that. And I would like to find out how, if I were to write, how Norwegians, or how people in America, in 30 years would identify themselves, or 40 years, or 50 years. Will they still trace back to say that I am now a little bit Norwegian and from my ancestors, or would I just forget that and simply be Americans? And that is something I would be interested in trying to find out. If this identity with ethnicity, is that something that would last for us? I am working with, his name is Jeff Kinstead. He was my student at St. Olaf College, and he's a fourth generation Norwegian-American, and he has now written about that, and he still celebrates being Norwegian. And could I ask here, now then, is there any first generation Norwegian sitting here? From Norway, yeah. How many second generation Norwegians? And third generation? Yeah, a lot of you have grandparents who came from Norway, yeah. So that is nice. And I suppose you talk about your grandparents and where they came from in Norway, and that's a part of your life too. And it certainly is a part of mine, where I came from. I feel, in my memoirs where I wrote, I call that two homelands, both Norway and the United States. But when I identify myself now, I do identify myself as an American, because I am an American citizen, and not I gave up my Norwegian citizenship to become an American. But I do consider Norway my first homeland, and this is my second homeland. I think that's as much as I have to say.
I think that's beautiful. I think I should also mention that you told me the other day that you're still writing, you're still working, and you told me the other day that you're actually researching a story on Norwegian immigration to South Africa. Oh, yeah. and even to New Zealand. So we might be lucky enough fortunate enough to experience another piece from.
Yes, when I told friends in Norway that I was working on the colony that Norwegian tried to in South Africa in Natal, he quoted Ibsen, who said, "The Norwegians, they will travel." And maybe that's true. But I just finished an article about the colony, Marburg in South Africa, that the Norwegians tried to then settle. And most of the Norwegians who sailed there in 1882, they came from Sunnmøre, which is where I came from in Norway too. And so in Sunnmøre, they're much interested in what I have to say there. And it was actually very much, we should always keep in mind that beginning in the mid-1800s, Norway became one of the major missionary countries, sent missionaries all over the world. And the 1882 sailing to Natal, South Africa, was a part of having a colony that could spread Christianity. And so that was much a part of it. And they did try to settle in, but this found out that South Africa was more difficult than they thought it would be. And many of them went back to Norway. They built a church, and the church is still there. And I've been trying to be in touch with people there. And the Norwegians, there are now many Norwegians, and I have found out that the person who was interviewed, not by me, but by somebody else, said that she now considers herself a South African and not a Norwegian. And so that also happens. But I have this article, but the colony never came about because the Norwegians moved to other parts of South Africa. And so it's not they're still living in Marburg, but it's not a colony. It's just a settlement of Norwegians that still live there. And and of course, I always wanted to study the Norwegian colony in New Zealand, because I found out when I tried to study that And years ago, I wanted to go to New Zealand to write something about them, and found out that they still celebrate May 17th, Norway Constitution Day, even though they came over there in the mid-1880s, and most of them from Østerdalen, the most eastern valley in Norway. And I think it would be interesting to see if I had the strength, and if I lived another 100 years, I would do it. Yeah.
So with that, I think we'll just open up the floor to questions. Are there any questions? Please raise your hand.
It was,
I will just repeat questions.
oh, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. You had mentioned your mother being left a few times alone with the kids. And then you also mentioned while you were writing and researching that you were traveling around. So I'm wondering, did you leave your wife alone with the kids or did they come with?
My wife came with me. She was very much interested. And I must tell you that we at home, we talked so much about what I was doing. She was so interested in what I was doing all the time. And she did not come to Chicago when I was doing research, but she came with me to Chicago to launch the book. And then she was my guide to Logan Square, because she did the maps for Logan Square, Chicago, for me. That's how much interest she had in this. And she was quite aware that I would be gone a couple of weeks. She thought that was just fine, because when I came back, I called her from Chicago every single day. And even when I taught at the University of Oslo, we were together. And she did come. She did, when I was teaching there, I taught at the University of Oslo for 9 years, from 1996 until 2005. And the reason I did that was that my daughter moved back to Norway, and I have then 2 grandsons in Norway, so that's why I want to see them grow up. So I accepted the invitation from the University of Oslo to teach there, and I taught there then for about 2 months every year, and St. Olaf College allowed me to do that, and which I appreciate very much, because the connection to them was important. And then Elsa did come, my wife did come 2-3 times when I was teaching her, and stayed a month with me in Oslo before she went back to America. And she thought that this is something that I should do, because of my grandchildren and my daughter living in Norway.
You had mentioned the panic that people in Norway felt when the Germans invaded Norway. My question is how your family felt, or how the community felt when year after year after year the occupation went on, and how you dealt with that.
Yeah, well, it was a difficult time during World War II. There's no doubt about that. I know my mother was so worried that she would not get enough food for us, because sometimes we were short. And here the newspaper reported, and people talked about that, because where I lived in Norway, where the young Norwegian men fled to England, and they entered into the resistance movement. And if they were caught before they were able to get out of Norway, they were executed. And I so remember that horrible things, hearing about young men being shot to death by a German. And I mean, all these memories are very difficult to think about, but they were there all the time. And I know that people tried to do things still, to get together, but there was not a single day almost that there wasn't some, because the Germans allowed the newspapers to report all these ugly things. And I already mentioned when the Jews were taken away from Warsaw. And one thing to keep in mind is that since this coastal city was where a young Norwegian escaped to England, or Scotland, basically, the Germans were able to get a lot of Nazi police. I mean, rather than being loyal kind of Norwegians, they were Nazi police who also would arrest other. We should not forget that the Germans themselves never arrested anyone. Norwegian Nazis did, and that was something you never knew who the Nazis were, and they were people that you feared that somebody tried to find something to do to please the Germans. And those are horrible things to talk about and to think about during the war.
We have one more question over there. Able to hand him the mic? Yeah.
How did it happen that the immigrants were on sailing ships came to Canada instead of New York?
The reason for that was the British Navigation Act was repealed, and the Norwegian companies, because by 1849 the Norwegian sailing ship had been organized in companies of sailing ships, and here they saw an opportunity since they were allowed to go to Canada, and they could transport then timber to England and back, and so the Norwegians took advantage of that, and Norway had a large fleet of sailing ships that could take advantage of it, and this was much cheaper. So for about 10, 15 years, Norwegians went to Canada because it was much cheaper, but about 90% did, and they did not come to New York in those years, but they came to Canada instead because it was cheaper. And then they had to make it south. There were some people stayed out. I have written a book about that if you're interested. About the Norwegians who tried to settle on the coast of Canada. I was up there 5 times studying what happened up there and talked to people, and it was quite an ordeal then to come to Minnesota or Illinois or Wisconsin to settle. But there were agents from these countries, from these states, I mean, who tried to direct these Norwegian immigrants to come to their place. So they did not intend to stay in Canada, they intended to come to the United States. But they did, some of them did actually settle in Quebec. And I did talk to, when I was up there, descendants of these Norwegians who still live there. So there is a small, but it was never successful. But that's why they did it. And then after a while, New York took over again.
Okay, I guess that's it. Thank you all for coming. I just want to mention, I want to first of all thank you for coming here today, and thank you for your great contribution over the years. In closing, I should also say that this was obviously made possible by Norway House, but this podcast series was made possible with something called Norway House Foundation out of San Francisco, and this podcast was made in conjunction with løfterike. Okay, that's it. Thank you all for coming.